Welcome back to Yoga Berry, your yoga for scoliosis community. I'm Christine Jareggi-Berry. I'm a yoga teacher specializing in yoga for scoliosis. And today's video is inspired by a question from one of you guys on the YouTube channel. And it's all about cat-cow pose and how to practice cat-cow correctly for scoliosis. So all that you need is your yoga mat. We don't need any fancy equipment for this. If you want to follow along, just get on your mat and I'll meet you in a moment. So before we start practicing this pose, let's talk about the benefits of cat-cow pose for a moment. And if you're not quite sure which pose I mean, so cat-cow is this lovely opening and then the rounding of the spine that you come across in a pretty much most yoga classes if you attend general yoga classes. And I find it particularly beneficial for anyone with back pain, with scoliosis or other back-related issues, because it releases all the muscles around the spine. It mobilizes the spine, it opens the front, so it really takes that opening of the chest, and then you're opening the back of the body as well when you're rounding. So one other thing just to consider is, do you have a spinal fusion or don't you have a spinal fusion? So if you don't have a fusion, then fantastic, then we'll get straight into it. But if you do have spinal fusion, you will know that this pose might be your enemy already, because you don't maybe have that flexibility in your spine, and it kind of depends on when you had your fusion done. So if you're relatively young, then you might have one of those good spinal fusions where you still have lots of flexibility in the back. But if you are a little bit older and you've got one of those Harrington rods, then you probably don't have a lot of movement in the back. Now, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't do or you can't do the pose at all. It just means you have to be a little bit more conservative, let's say, with the pose. So what I want you to do, if you have a spinal fusion and one of those rigid spinal fusions, then just kind of notice which parts of your spine are very mobile, and that is usually above and below the fusion, and which parts are really rigid. So when you come into the pose, we think about length rather than trying to move every single part. That might not be the best thing to do, especially if you're just then making the bits that are already flexible more flexible and the other bits are not really moving. So you can still do the pose, but just hold it back a little bit and don't go into your full range. Good. So let's get started. For anyone else, we'll start on, or for everyone really, let's start in all fours. And just bring your hands directly underneath the shoulders and the knees directly underneath the hips. So we're just kind of establishing our starting point here. And with scoliosis, obviously what we do have to consider is that the curvature to the side is also accompanied by rotation. So sometimes if we then go into our fullest range, it just kind of makes that, it locks into that rotation, and it's not very, very good for us. So again, what we want to do is we want to focus on length rather than going into your full range. So what I mean by that, if we come into cat-cow, so I will talk you through it to begin with. So we're gonna just allow for the shoulder blades to draw down at the back. And then see if you can kind of notice the direction that the tailbone is pointing towards. So we're going to imagine that it's pointing straight towards the back of the room, and the crown of the head is pointing towards the front of the room. And they're going to move in opposite directions. So we're going to allow for the spine to lengthen as much as possible. So already you might notice that I'm coming a little bit into this arching. So I'm going to lift the chest ever so slightly, lifting the back of the neck, slightly the head, and then I'm going into a little bit more rounded position. And this comes from the center of the body. So I'm drawing the navel slightly back to the spine. But I'm just taking a very, very mini cat-cow pose to begin with. So I'm opening, imagine opening the front of the body, lifting the chest. And then exhaling, I'm rounding slightly through the spine. And then you can slowly ease your way into the pose and make it a little bit bigger. Especially if you enjoy that opening where we're drawing the shoulders back at the back, and then rounding, drawing the navel back to the spine. Now notice that my head doesn't do very much. So sometimes what I see is people kind of, there's not much happening in the back, but they're doing this. So they're lifting the head, dropping the head. Now, this is not a neck exercise. This is an exercise for the whole of the spine. And the neck is just the extension of the rest of the spine. So when I drop my belly, when I lift my chest, then the head will come up. I inhale, and then when I exhale and draw the belly, the navel back to the spine, I round, and then I drop my head. So the head only moves because of the rest of the spine. So just kind of take a few rounds, just kind of noticing how this feels. So this is without adjusting anything at the moment. We're just kind of enjoying the movement. Inhaling and exhaling. Good, let's do one more and let the movement become a little bit bigger. Inhaling and exhale. The other thing that we want to avoid, especially if you have quite a mobile lower back, so for me this is very tempting because my lower back is very mobile. I could just completely collapse into my lower back, but that doesn't do very much for my upper spine. So I actually hold myself back slightly and I work on lifting up through the chest rather than really trying to arch through the spine. Good, so let's release for a moment, and you can either come into child's pose or just sit back on your heels. Release the wrists for a moment. There's quite a lot of work in the hands and in the wrists. So we don't want them to kind of stiffen up and get upset. So let's release them for a moment, maybe wiggling the fingers. Good, and then we're going to come back into this, and I'll show you a little adjustment that I do for my S-curve scoliosis. So I have a right thoracic, left lumbar curve. Now my thoracic curve is very mild, so I have mainly a left lumbar curve, which is why you don't see much of a rib hump for me. I also have been working with scoliosis for quite a long time, so I have definitely improved it. But we are going to start with the rounding of the spine. So we're going to draw the navel back to the spine and then allowing for the whole of the spine to round. It's very tempting just to round the shoulders, but we want the whole of the spine to round also. So think really about the mid-back. And then if you were looking from the outside, you would see that the right shoulder, the right rib cage is slightly higher than the left for a right thoracic curve. So what we want to do is we want to kind of soften that right side a little bit, and we want to lift up through the left side a little bit more. And I do this by pressing into my hand, into the left hand, to lift the left side of the rib cage a little bit more. And I just take a few breaths just into that left side of the rib cage. And that actually also creates space. It creates space at the back of the lungs, at the left side of the rib cage. And it's a really nice adjustment. Good, and then I'm just going to release. And then when I go into my arching position, I'm going to think about my lumbar curve. So I'm going to think about lengthening through the right side of the waist. So my right sitting bones go back a little bit more than my left sitting bone. So hopefully you can see this a little bit. So if I come back and would just do the normal cat-cow pose, I would just kind of tip here, but I'm actually shifting the hips over to the left slightly so that I'm lengthening through the right side of the waist. And then I'm just going to lift the chest ever so slightly, coming into that arching. So again, let's round. So for the rounding, it's really lovely to work on that thoracic curve. So I'm pressing through the left side, lifting through the left side a little bit more. Let the right side soften a little bit more. And then I'm coming back to center and then coming into the cow pose, so the arching. I'm going to lengthen the right side of the waist, lifting up through the chest. Good, and then release. Good, so these were a little bit more advanced instructions. So if you are interested in learning more about yoga for scoliosis, then do check out my next 4 weeks course where we really go into detail about how we can tailor our practice to our individual curves. Otherwise, I really hope that you enjoyed this, that it gave you a little bit of insight and that you can start to experiment a little bit more with this pose. And I see you very soon for the next video.